Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar where we will be providing information about the recently released Kentucky Post-Secondary Education Progress Report. My name is Lee Nimmux, Vice President for Strategy and Chief of Staff with CPE. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. Most of you are joining us through YouTube. Please make sure the comment section is used so you can ask any questions. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll share those questions with the presenters throughout the session. We'll also reserve some time at the end for Q&A. This session will be recorded and posted on CPE's YouTube channel for you to refer back to if needed or to share with others. So before we jump into the meat of the session, I want to talk briefly about the role that CPE plays in statewide post-secondary education planning and accountability, and how this links back to the report that you'll hear about today. As many of you who've registered for this webinar know, CPE is charged with leading the development of a statewide strategic agenda for post-secondary education. This agenda, which is revisited annually and updated completely every 5 or 6 years, articulates the mission, values, priorities, and high-level objectives driving higher education in Kentucky. The current agenda also lays out Kentucky's big goal for higher education: to increase the overall level of educational attainment in the state so that by 2030, at least 60% of working age adults will have earned at least a post-secondary certificate or higher. You'll hear more about this later. The current agenda, Stronger by Degrees, is aligned with the strategic plans of all Kentucky's public colleges and universities. It provides the foundation for the state's performance funding system. It's the basis for Kentucky's diversity and equity planning structure, and it guides the day-to-day work of CPE. The report you'll hear about today is one piece of the larger accountability structure that's been built to monitor and drive both state and institution-level progress and performance on the strategic agenda. The metrics in this report only represent a small portion of the data that CPE collects and analyzes on a daily basis. These KPIs were vetted by a number of groups who helped develop the strategic agenda and have been determined to provide a high-level assessment of performance towards the agenda's objectives. Most of the KPIs include performance targets that were negotiated with each campus and provide an additional way to measure progress towards goals. One final note before we jump into the data: we are nearing the end of the time frame for the current strategic agenda, and we'll be working with campuses and other stakeholders over the next year as we consider updates to the goals and strategies and performance measures. The final progress report under this agenda will be released next spring. So now I'm going to turn things over to David Mahan, our Associate Vice President for Data and Advanced Analytics, who will begin the discussion about the report.
Thank you, Lee, and welcome to everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to thank both our internal team and our campus partners for making this possible. You will note the scope of this report is enormous. This is, of course, over a 5-year period, and we're doing a 1-year progress report. And there's a number of metrics that were validated by every campus, and we had a tremendous team to do that work. So I'd like to introduce Melissa Young, our Executive Director of Special Projects, who did much of the layout and the design, as well as the writing. Travis Muncie, who oversees the data collection and has written a new progress report interactive online tool, which we will show you at the end of the webinar. And then Carrie Hodge, she's our most recent addition to our team, and she jumped in with both feet, and we'd like to thank her for her tremendous efforts. Next slide. So as many of you have seen, we have 3 areas of the strategic agenda: opportunity, success, and impact. Opportunity is the assessment of how many of our students are entering post-secondary from Kentucky, and the affordability question of the actual cost to get a credential from our institutions. Success is the proportion of our students that complete, mostly graduation rates and completion rates, but we focus on those highest risk populations, such as low-income students and students of color. And then with impact, we look at workforce need and the output of the number of graduates coming from Kentucky institutions. And specifically, we look at credentials in areas such as STEM and healthcare, especially important in the middle of our COVID-19 crisis. We also disaggregate that by our low-income students and our students of color so that we know what parts of our population are increasing and if they're meeting that workforce need. So before I turn it over for a detailed look at the metrics, I'd like you guys to consider framing the assessment of the progress report in a couple of ways. First, as Lee said, the completion numbers that feed our 60 by 30 attainment goal is critically important. So are we on path? Are we on track to meet our attainment goal in the year 2030? And we know the importance of that to Kentucky residents. You're going to see some very good news there. So our production is up in terms of short-term certificates, and it's also it also has increased in terms of the number of students of color that have earned a credential at both the KCTCS Community and Technical College and at our four-year publics. But you're also going to see challenges when we begin to talk about closing gaps. And so you are going to see increases in graduation rates, but you're going to also see some challenging areas. So at KCTCS, there has been much progress made in closing gaps, comparing our URM students to the overall population and our low-income students to the overall population. There has been much progress made with the low-income population, but the minority student gap continues to exist. With the four-year public institutions, you're going to see the reverse effect. So much progress has been made in terms of more students of color proportionately completing their degrees and closing that graduation gap. But then for our low-income students, you're going to see that gap continues to be significant. So I'd like to turn this over to Carrie so that she can tell you a little bit more about these highlights, and then we'll go directly into the details of the report.
Thank you, David. To start off with, I want to give you an idea of what all goes into making our progress report. The progress report covers 18 different measures, many of which can be disaggregated by underrepresented minority and low-income students. The progress report includes almost 2,000 individual data cells, with each cell undergoing a very rigorous validation process. Validation occurs through KPEDS-NG, as well as through multiple checks with individual institutions and within the office itself to correct any discrepancies that may occur. This validation process begins when we make campus scorecards and continues up until the progress report. As this slide shows, the progress report highlights several areas of progress, such as educational attainment, degree credential production, and graduation rates and achievement gaps. Some challenges that we will face in the future, such as in-state college going rate, Kentucky adults enrolled in college, and 2-year to 4-year transfer after completion. And then some metrics that are holding steady, such as completion rates, college readiness, and state funding per student. I'm now going to hand it over to Melissa, who will explain the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Carrie. Lee mentioned at the outset that Kentucky has a big educational attainment goal, and that's for 60% of Kentuckians to have a post-secondary certificate or a degree by the year 2030. We're not alone in this endeavor. There are 47 states that have established a similar attainment goal. The Lumina Foundation is the catalyst for this movement. About a decade ago, they set a long-term goal for America, for 60% of Americans to have a college credential by the year 2025. As you can see in this graph, Kentucky is making tremendous strides in educational attainment. And especially now that the Lumina Foundation has been able to include certificate holders in the percentages. Much of our progress on this metric is due to the growth of short-term certificates at KCTCS. As you can see at the beginning here of this graph in 2014, there was nearly a 3 percentage point difference between Kentucky and the national average. But in 2018, the gap has narrowed to 1.5 percentage points. This signals that Kentucky's workforce is really becoming more competitive, and that's really going to be important as we look to the future. I think many of you have heard this statistic, but in the 10 years following the Great Recession, 95% of all new jobs created required some post-secondary education and training. And I think when we do begin to recover from COVID-19, we might expect to see a similar trend. So Kentucky will need college-educated workers to take advantage of this future job growth, and we are working with KCTCS to get a clearer picture of the sub-associate credentials and their value in the marketplace. Next slide. So this next slide looks at the educational attainment levels without the benefit of short-term certificates. So what we're seeing here are the percentage of individuals with an associate degree or higher. As you can see, Kentucky is 7.2 percentage points behind the national average when you take away the sub-associate credentials. So there are some work to do there. There's also significant gaps by race and ethnicity, which this slide highlights. The attainment rate for white Kentuckians is 8.7 percentage points higher than Latinx and 9.1 percentage points higher than Black Kentuckians. So we do have some work to do to increase access and success for minority students. David is now going to cover the next couple of slides.
So again, when we talk about our 60 by 30 attainment goal, we know the importance of staying on track on a yearly, evaluating this on a yearly rate. And so the 1.7% average annual growth rate was something that we calculated with several working groups at the beginning of this in 2015. And we know that we need this, this growth in the number of completers per year to stay on track. And you can see in 2018-19, we had a tremendous year, 42,179 completers. That's an unduplicated count. That 3.5% represents almost double of what we needed. But to stay on path to meet this goal, we will need to continue to attract more adults into higher education enrollment, as well as continue to increase our college going rate for our in-state high school graduates. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, most of our growth was from certificates and diplomas from our community and technical system. But we also had a 2% growth from KCTCS and associate's degrees. And that's very significant considering in previous years, that number had been relatively flat. So in areas that we critically need workforce, such as associate degrees in nursing, there was an increase. You will see no change in the baccalaureate degree numbers. The Kentucky public universities were slightly down and the private institutions were slightly up, which accounted for pretty much no growth in this area. And we're certainly going to keep a close eye on that metric. The number of graduate degrees, you see the fourth bullet there. Much growth has been online from our privates, especially in master's degrees for computer science. So you will see much increased numbers there from the online offerings. And then the second bullet from the bottom, again, our number of minority students completing credentials grew over 6% overall. But what's really impressive is that it's across multiple degree levels. So at KCTCS and at the baccalaureate level, where I just mentioned that we did not have growth, and of course at the graduate level as well. The last bullet there is a little less concerning because this is our past economy, which had much good news for many of our Kentucky residents with a low unemployment rate. That impacted the number of low-income students in terms of enrollment at our institutions. And then ultimately there was less that completed. So we're down slightly there, but we know that will be subject to change in the very near future.
Okay, and that leads us to graduation rates. So with enrollment dropping, it's very impressive that the state is still able to increase its overall post-secondary attainment. And you may wonder, how's this happening? Well, our institutions are doing a great job increasing the graduation rate, and they're actually doing a better job with the students that do enroll at their institution. And you can actually see this in the slide. KCTCS, for example, has increased its graduation rate by almost 10 percentage points in only 5 years. At 33.9% this year, KCTCS has managed to outpace the national average for two-year public institutions, which stands at only 24%. Even though KCTCS has done a wonderful job on their overall graduation rate, gaps do still remain for historically underserved populations. A 2.4 percentage point gap exists for low-income students, and a much larger 11.2% percentage point gap remains for our underrepresented minority students. Our hope is that with the policies such as the diversity policy and other incentives built into the performance funding model, these gaps will gradually close. And now we move on to the four-year public institutions. For our four-year public institutions, we kind of see the same story. Although not at the rate of KCTCS, the graduation rate has slowly risen, climbing almost 6 percentage points in the last 5 years. At 55%, the graduation rate is still slightly below the national average of 60%, but our institutions are steadily closing that gap. And when we look at how the four-year public institutions are doing with their underserved populations, we see the reverse of KCTCS. The gap for underrepresented minority students is closing. It's fell from 11.8 percentage points last year to 11.5 percentage points this year, while the gap for low-income students is growing, rising from 12.6% last year to 13.5% this year. And now let's take a look at completion rates. Unlike the graduation rate metric, which only tracks students who enroll and graduate at the same institution, the completion rate looks at the students that graduate from any institution of the same level in the nation. With this in mind, we see a higher percentage of students graduating, but the trend is very similar to what we see with graduation rates. For our four-year public institutions, we see a steady gain of over 5 percentage points over the last 5 years. And this is very much in line with the national trend for all four-year public institutions. Although not as pronounced as our four-year institutions, we also see an upward trend of over 3 percentage points over the last 5 years for KCTCS. This is also in line with the national average for two-year public institutions. And you'll actually see a pretty big fall from fall 2016 to 2017. And we actually spoke with our KCTCS counterparts, and that looks like that was just the end of the enrollment surge from the Great Recession. And that's kind of what you're seeing graphically there. But KCTCS has done a wonderful job to actually recover from that and to, and increase their completion rates after that drop. So now we can also talk about outcome measures and kind of what we're looking to do in the future. And even with the good news with graduation rates, we're also aware that the metric does not tell the whole story. The population for graduation rates uses a very traditional cohort. This cohort is first-time, full-time students who enroll in the summer or the fall. With the newly emphasized importance of non-traditional students like adults and transfer students, we have started the process of adopting the iPad metric of outcome measures. Although still graduation rate, the outcome measure metric uses a greatly expanded population. The cohort includes all entering students, such as transfers, non-first time, part-time students, and it also cohorts for the entire year, so you don't just receive that traditional cohort of summer and fall. And our hope is that by using the outcome measures, we can get a more holistic view of the student population's graduation rate. And we've also already put the mechanisms in place to track outcome measures. And our hope is that we can include this in the upcoming strategic agenda. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa. You're muted, Melissa.
Thank you, Travis. We've talked a lot about the institutional metrics that we've been tracking. This is a statewide metric, Kentucky's in-state college going rate. So this is the percentage of high school graduates who enter an in-state post-secondary institution in the fall following their graduation. Unfortunately, this metric does not capture the students that go out of state. Our sister agency, KY Stats, estimates that percentage is around 5%, and that would put our statewide college going rate around 57%. That's significantly below the college going rate nationally of 70%. And I think that, you know, the downward trend that we're seeing suggests, again, we have some issues. We have some issues with college access and perhaps affordability. And the college going rates for our minority populations are also concerning. Next slide. Another concern for the state is the decline that we've seen in enrollment among non-traditional adult students. And these are students who are 25 and older. As many of you know, the number of high school students in the pipeline is projected to decrease from now until 2030. So it's really important to engage more of these adult students if we hope to reach our goals. In fact, you see on the graph that our goal is to enroll 4% of our adult population without a college credential, and that's about 70,000 adults. Now, it could be that the rise in unemployment due to the COVID-19 crisis might reverse this trend. We might see more adults going back to retrain for new careers, but we need to be proactive to reach out to these adults, and we really need to design competency-based and accelerated programming that helps them reach their goals in less time. And I'm going to throw it back to Carrie now to do our final slide.
Thank you, Melissa. Another area of concern is net cost. For several years, institutions were able to stabilize tuition increases. However, with budget cuts, the average net price has risen. Even though the cost for full-time students has increased, Kentucky's four-year public and two-year public cost have remained below the national average. KCTCS has actually decreased their average net price by 6% from 2016-17 to 2017-18. And as you can see on this slide, the U.S. average in 2017-18 was a little over $20,000 for a four-year public and $9,000 for a public two-year. And as you can see, Kentucky was at $18,411 and KCTCS was at $5,840. So even though we do have a cost that's gone up, it is still remaining below the national average, which is a positive. And I'm going to turn everything over to Travis and David now at this point.
So we'd like to take this time to give you guys an interactive demo with our data center on our council website. Travis is going to show you a couple of enrollment slides, and I'm going to show you a couple of financial aid reports that help us drill down into data points that may be particularly useful as we plan for the fall in these uncertain times.
And David, if you'd like, I can go ahead and kind of just do an overview of the data center. So basically on our website, if you go to our cpe.ky.gov website, and I actually go back here and you go under data and then interactive charts, you will see our interactive data center and kind of what we have available there. We have over 20 published dashboards out here currently. Everything from degrees, diversity, dual credit, enrollment. So we have put a lot of time and hard work into this portion of the website. So if anybody out there, if you get time, please go out and take a look. And hopefully, the right information will be out there to answer any kind of Kentucky higher education questions that you have. But I'm sorry, David, didn't mean to interrupt you. You can go ahead.
No, continue. So we want to look at first a couple of enrollment reports that we feel like are very appropriate as we look at international students and as we look at out-of-state students as our institutions plan for the fall.
And Tableau's reloading. Hold on. There we go. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay.
So Travis, go ahead and take us through this report and the out-of-state enrollment report. So just to give a brief overview of which countries we're getting the most international students from, as well as just the overall counts. And you can think about the growth as we plan for the fall.
Okay. And with this is just a visual representation of our international enrollees for our 4-year and 2-year public institutions. So basically, you'll see that Saudi Arabia this year, so this academic year 2019-20 is actually fall 2019. So the enrollment for fall 2019. And Saudi Arabia has actually been our leading country as far as overall count of international students for a while, but you'll actually see, even if we go back here to the previous fall, that number is slowly declining. But what you do see is an increase in Chinese nationality students. So you'll see, like with 2018-19, that was at 234. And then if we go to fall 2019, or academic year 19-20, we'll see that has actually risen to 307, and the number of Saudi Arabian students has actually dropped. So I guess the overall takeaway would be that the Saudi Arabian students, the population has slowly dropped, and we are actually getting a bump in the Chinese national students who attend our universities and KCTCS.
So the enrollment report, which we have used for about 2 or 3 years now, shows a trend analysis by sector and then by student groups. And so you get a good sense for the yearly change and the overall 5 and 10-year change. And so Travis, if you would, let's just look at degrees taken students at 4-year publics that are from out of state.
You went just undergraduate?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And you can see that there's been a flattening of this number, to date, but it is certainly significant to keep an eye on, because as I'm going to show you in a minute with the financial aid side, the revenue projections are very much contingent upon keeping this group or maintaining this level of enrollment. So, but you do get a sense for all the way back to 2010, 2011. And Travis, maybe you could just highlight a couple of the other filters there so that they can see the possibilities of disaggregating this in multiple ways.
Okay. Well, the beauty of setting this up in Tableau is you are able to basically put as many filters on the dashboard as basically variables that you have in the data set. So one good way is you can differentiate by first time in college, or you can even break it down by gender, URM, underrepresented minority, and you are even able to put take the underrepresented minority and low income. That's a very powerful combination, and you do see that our low income data does lag a little bit of our other data. But yeah, so even we were talking about adult students, so you are able to specify an age range of exactly who you want to look at. So if you want to be able to really target a certain population and kind of see how those trends go, it's a very powerful tool to be able to do that, because you can get very specific with the exact population you want to track over time. Like I said, this dashboard is a very effective tool for doing that.
Yeah. So let's look at the financial aid interactive report, and then we can briefly show you our new interactive tool with the progress report, and then we'll turn it over to Lee for questions and answers. So what out-of-state students pay is the first dashboard. So let's go back, Travis, to the out-of-state students pay one. Okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm going back. There you go.
So this starts at cost of attendance, and we back out institutional aid, state and federal aid, as well as loans. And then you get a sense by campus what each out-of-state student is investing in their education. Now, of course, if you know cost of attendance, you realize that it includes room and board and spending money and transportation costs and all kinds of other things. So it's a very generous estimate of the full cost of what it takes to go to school for a year. But this is really good. This is a really good assessment of the local economy's impact, right? So if we say, on average, say at Western, if the out-of-state student is putting about $16,000 not only into Western's revenue stream, but also into Bowling Green's. And so it's important to note that we can look at these things in a variety of ways and really give you a sense for, again, an estimate of what students are actually paying to go to an institution. And Travis, then if you could go to estimated revenue. This was built, the campuses ask us to do a very basic, and again, these are all estimates because these aren't official numbers in the strategic agenda. We have not validated to a very precise number, but it is a good way to analyze the impact of potential enrollment changes. So when we talk about enrollment changes for fall and you see folks projecting anywhere from a 15 to a 25% decrease, that is not going to be consistent across all institutions or all institution types or all student groups or degree levels. And so what we hope to have these tools do is empower campuses and others to really look at the revenue per student based on very individual student groups. So this is degree-seeking undergrads at four-year public universities in Kentucky, broken down by out-of-state students in the red bar. Blue is the in-state students, and then that light green is our reciprocity students, and they are out-of-state students, but they're charged in-state tuition because of agreements we have with bordering states. And so you get a sense for the type of revenue that is projected. So it's basically the tuition and fees less the institutional aid. How much revenue per student does an out-of-state student add to, say, Northern Kentucky? And then if you highlight Northern Kentucky's red bar there, Travis, you can also get a sense for how many students that is. So that's 1,944 students right there on the Cincinnati border. And they estimate about $14,000 in tuition and fee revenue from each one of those students. So then you can do projections on how that might impact if they had a 5% decrease or a 2%, or maybe no decrease at all would be ideal. But all our campuses are really preparing for all scenarios. So the last thing we would like to show you, and Travis, if you could just pull up the progress report from our main dashboard.
Yep.
This is something that Travis and his team worked super hard on because we'd like to get all of the data around the progress report into one place. And so what this amounts to is a scorecard for each campus or the KCTCS system. So if you go to, let's just go to universities there. And then let's just select, University of Louisville since they're close right there. And this is their scorecard in terms of all the progress report metrics that we discussed. It includes their targets and gives you a sense of their their progress towards each one of those targets. And yeah, Travis, if you would highlight the yellow button there on the right-hand side, we've embedded in mouse overs the definitions of each of these metrics because there is a lot of nuance in higher education data. And we really want you to understand which groups we're talking about. So if we're talking about undergraduate enrollment at U of L, are we talking about including dual enrollment students, including non-degree students and the rest? And so those mouse overs tell you exactly what you're looking at. You can also see first to second year retention, which we didn't cover in this report, but there's a lot of good news around retention, which is a predictor of future graduation rates. And so we do think we're making really good progress there. So without further ado, let's turn this back over to Lee, and she can monitor the question and answer.
Sure thing, David. And we have just two questions right now from Susan Weston. The first is about the graduation rate gap metric. The question is whether or not the gap is calculated based on the difference between the URM students and all students, or between URM and non-URM students.
So the answer is that gap is all students, including URM, and it is a comparison of students of color versus the entire population. But if you go to our dashboards under graduation rates, you can disaggregate that in multiple ways. So that's a good point. The other important point is we have all the definitions on how we define a URM student, also populated on that web page.
Okay, the second question is about the net price metric and whether or not it's calculated with an inflation adjustment or not.
Travis, do you want to take that one?
No, the net price, that's an actual iPads metric. And I don't think it includes any kind of inflation adjustment. I think it's just the basic worksheet, the basic iPads worksheet that takes cost of attendance and then subtracts out any kind of grants or scholarships to leave the net price. So no, it does not include any inflation adjustment.
And one thing we should probably add there. So I showed the out-of-state metrics on what out-of-state students actually pay. The net price is an in-state calculation. It's important to note that there's a completely different population of students that also need to be considered there. The other piece to net price is that that beginning cost of attendance is relatively high and maybe not as close as a direct cost to what students pay. And so we're able to disaggregate that in multiple ways, but it is important to continue to look at net price because it is something that is the official financial aid piece of packaging students. And so that way we get a real sense for, what students are awarded based on their official records.
Great. Well, I have a question I'll throw out, David, and I'm wondering if you could respond to this for the group. As I mentioned in the introduction, we are beginning the process of thinking about the next iteration of the strategic agenda. And if you could sort of step back and look at how we have measured progress on this agenda, where do you if you could crystal ball gaze a little bit,
Mhm.
where do you think we need to go in terms of what we measure and what we value? What are we missing right now in terms of our performance metrics?
Yeah, no, thank you, Lee. I think that's a great place to start. And we've already had preliminary conversations with many of our institutional research offices on this very question. So we're super excited as we begin to, let's just say, recalibrate and think about the measures that would be in a new strategic agenda. I would start with the number of adult completers. We measure the enrollment of adults, but we really need to understand how many adults are crossing that stage and entering our workforce as a separate metric, and have institutions set targets around it so that we can be really laser focused on this population that is critical for us to meet that attainment goal. So I would definitely start there. The other metric that we've talked a good bit about, we're doing a better job with our KY Stats partners, with our longitudinal workforce folks, to really measure out how much students are earning and how many are employed after they leave our institutions. And so we need to think about those outcomes data in our strategic agenda as well, because we can do a great job of getting students to finish, but if they're not getting gainful employment that leads to opportunities and true middle class wages, then we're missing a key measure there. So I think I would start there. Travis did mention the outcome measures, which is something that IPEDS has moved to, and that will help us with our graduation rates, because we don't want to just look at the first-time full-time group in isolation. We want to look at all of our students and really get a sense for how many are completing, without excluding part-timers or transfer students and others. So I would start with those three metrics, Lee. Do you have additional thoughts for a vision?
No, I'm glad that you touched on this issue of transitions into the workforce, because I think that increasingly that's where we need to have our focus as a post-secondary system, assuring that our students are completing, but completing and moving into either additional education or a job that provides a meaningful wage and opportunity for growth. So I appreciate you responding to that. And I think that that's, it's a tough nut to crack. I know a lot of states are really trying to get their arms around how to measure successfully that sort of progress in that area. So that's something I think we'll be looking at and reaching out to our partners to help us think through.
Yeah. And I'd like to follow up with two reports that we are working quietly, but let's just say in a very focused way. And that would be first that in-state college going rate that Melissa discussed. It is really important that we get the out-of-state numbers in there as well. So we're partnering with KY Stats to understand, is this an issue in Kentucky that we need to address immediately, or is this something that we're doing better than we think because we have some of our students going to institutions right across the border? And then I would also say that we need to look at that in a longer term way, not just with immediate enrollment, but whether that high school group ultimately receives a credential. And some of those reports already exist on the KY Stats page. So I think that's an important piece. And the other research that I alluded to a little bit earlier was the value of the short-term credentials. And so we want to partner with KCTCS, KY Stats, and then we have a new partnership with the Martin School of Public Policy at the University of Kentucky to begin looking at the value of short-term certificates. And so when we talk about value, we talk about value to the workforce and whether we're meeting those critical needs, but we also need to look at the value to these individual families. So if you did, a 2-semester certificate with KCTCS, did your salary, did your employment opportunities change and increase in value for individual residents in the state of Kentucky? So we're excited about those two projects. I think will really enhance the metrics that you're currently looking at. But again, this is a large array of KPIs, key performance indicators. And so, we don't want to focus just on one or two things. We need to I encourage folks to look at the entire report and really get a sense for, the strengths and weaknesses there, and where that's going to lead to action for our policymakers and our institution leaders and other state leaders.
David, thanks for that. Before we close this off, I don't see any other questions in the YouTube chat. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us. I wanted to thank our team for providing the presentation. I also want to encourage folks to take a look at these dashboards that Travis shared. There are a few questions now that we can't answer with quantitative data, and I think CPE has done a good job with their partners in bringing that together in a way that's accessible and usable. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you to our team.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?